Page 466. From our experience of the past and our literature of the past, we have derived a naive faith in the power of a hunger strike. But the hunger strike is purely a moral weapon. It presupposes that the jailer has not entirely lost his conscience, or that the jailer is afraid of public opinion. Only in such circumstances can it be effective. The SARS jailers were still inexperienced. They got nervous if one of their prisoners went on a hunger strike. They exclaimed over it. They looked after him. They put him in the hospital. There are many examples, but this work is not about them. It is even humorous to note that it was enough for Valentinov to go on a hunger strike for 12 days. As a result, he not only achieved some relaxation in the regimen, but was totally released from interrogation, whereupon he went to Lenin in Switzerland. Even in the Oral Central Hard Labor Prison, the strikers always won. They got the regimen relaxed in 1912 and further relaxed in 1913, to the point of general access to outdoor walks for all political hard labor prisoners, who were obviously so unrestricted by their supervisors that they managed to compose and send out to freedom their appeal to the Russian people, and this from the hard labor prisoners of a central prison. Furthermore, it was published. It's enough to make one's eyes pop out of one's head. Someone has to have been crazy. It was published in 1914 in issue number 1 of the Vestnik Katorgi Silki, the Hard Labor and Exile Herald. And what about that herald itself? Should we too perhaps try to publish one like it? In 1914, after only 5 days of a hunger strike, admittedly without water, Dzerzhinsky and 4 of his comrades obtained all their numerous demands, which had to do with living conditions. In those years, there were no dangers or difficulties for the prisoner beyond the torments of hunger. They could not beat him up for going on a strike, nor sentence him to a second term, nor increase his term, nor shoot him, nor send him off on prisoner transport. All this was to come later on. In the Revolution of 1905 and the years following it, the prisoners felt themselves to be the masters of the prison, to such an extent that they did not even go to the trouble of declaring a hunger strike. They simply destroyed prison property, so-called obstructions, or went so far as to declare a strike, although it might seem that for prisoners this would have hardly any meaning. That's in the city of Nikolaev in 1906. 197 prisoners in the local prison declared a strike in conjunction with people outside. Outside the prison, leaflets in support of the strike were published and daily meetings assembled in front of the prison. These meetings, and it goes without saying that the prisoners were at the windows, which of course had no muzzles, forced the administration to accept the demands of the striking prisoners. After this, some people on the street and others behind bars joined in singing revolutionary songs. And things went on that way for 8 days, and nobody stopped them. It was, after all, a year of post-revolutionary repression. On the 9th day, all demands of the prisoners were satisfied. Similar incidents occurred in time in Odessa, in Kherson, and in Yelizavetgrad. That's how easily victory was attained then. It should be interesting, incidentally, to compare the effectiveness of hunger strikes under the provisional government with those few Bolshevik imprisoned from July days until the Kornilov episode, Kamenev, Trotsky, Raskolnikov, for a while longer, evidently had no reason to go on a hunger strike. In the 20s, the lively picture of hunger strikes grows clouded, though that depends, of course, on the point of view. This widely known weapon, which had justified itself so gloriously, was, of course, taken over not only by recognized officials, but also by those who were not recognized as such, the KRs, Article 58 counter-revolutionaries, and all other kinds of riffraff. However, those arrows, which used to be so piercing, had been blunted somehow, or else some iron hand had checked them in at mid-flight. True, written declarations of impending hunger strikes were still accepted, and nothing subversive was seen in them as yet, but unpleasant new rules were trotted out. The hunger strike had to be isolated in a special solitary cell in Butyrki. It was in the Pugachev Tower. It was essential to keep any knowledge about the hunger strike, not only from people outside who might protest publicly, and from prisoners in cells nearby, but even from those in the cell in which the hunger striker had been imprisoned until that day, for that too constituted a public, and it was necessary to separate him from it. This measure had as its nominal justification the argument that the prison administration had to make sure that the hunger strike was going on honestly, that others in the cell weren't sneaking food to the hunger striker. And how had that been verified previously? Through honest, cross-my-heart word of honor? Still, it was possible in those years to achieve at least one's personal demands by this means. From the 30s on, the state thinking about hunger strikes took a new turn. What did the state want, which even such watered-down, isolated, half-suppressed hunger strikers want with them? Hunger strikes. Wasn't the ideal picture of one of prisoners who had no will of their own, nor the capacity to make their own decisions, and of a prison administration that did their thinking and their deciding for them? These are, if you will, the only prisoners who can exist in the new society. And so from the beginning of the 30s, they stopped accepting declarations of hunger strikes as legal. A hunger strike as a method of resistance no longer exists. They proclaimed to Ekaterina Oblitskaya in 1932, and they said the same thing to many others. The government has abolished your hunger strikes, and that's that. But Oblitskaya refused to obey and began to fast. They let her go on fasting in solitary for 15 days. Then they took her to the hospital and put milk in dried crusts in front of her to tempt her, but she stood firm, and on the 19th day she won her victory. She got an extended outdoor period and newspapers and parcels from the political Red Cross. That's how one had to moan and groan in order to receive those legitimate relief parcels. Overall, however, it was an insignificant victory and paid for too dearly. Oblitskaya was called such foolish hunger strikes on the part of others too. People starved up to 20 days in order to get delivery of a parcel or a change of companions for their outdoor walk. Was it worth it? After all, the new type prison, one's strength was lost, could not be restored. The religious sect member Koloskov fasted until he died on the 25th day. Could one in general permit oneself to fast in the new type prison? After all, new prison heads operating in secrecy and silence had acquired several powerful methods of combating hunger strikes. One, patience on the part of the administration. We have seen enough of this what this meant from preceding examples. 2. Deception. This too can be practiced thanks to total secrecy. When every step is reported by the newspapers, you aren't going to do much deceiving. But in our country, why not? In 1933, in the Khabarovsk prison, Ch.12, demanding that his family be informed of his whereabouts, fasted for 17 days. He had come from the Chinese Eastern Railroad in Manchuria, and then suddenly disappeared, and he was worried about what his wife might be thinking. On the 17th day, Zapadny, the deputy chief of the provincial GPU and the Khabarovsk province prosecutor, the ranks indicate that lengthy hunger strikes were really not so frequent, came to see him and showed him a telegraph receipt. There, they said, they had informed his wife, and thus persuaded him to take some broth, and the receipt was a fake. Why had these high-ranking officials gone to this trouble? Not certainly for Ch.12's wife. Evidently, in the first half of the 30s, there was still some sort of personal responsibility on the part of higher-ups for long, drawn-out hunger strikes. 3. Forced artificial feeding. This method was adapted, without any question, from experience with wild animals in captivity, and it could be employed in total secrecy. For example, in the group hunger strike of socialists in the Yaroslavl Central Prison, artificial feeding was forced on everyone on the 15th day. Artificial feeding has much in common with rape, and that's what it really is. Poor big men hurl themselves on 1 week being and deprive it of one's interdiction. They only need to do it once, and what happens to it next is not important. The element of rape inheres that in violation of the victim's will. It's not going to be the way you want it, but the way I want it. Lie down and submit. They pry open the mouth with a flat disc. They broaden the crack between the jaws and insert a tube. Swallow it. And if you don't swallow it, they shove it farther down anyway, and they pour liquefied food right down the esophagus. And then they massage the stomach to prevent the prisoner from resorting to vomiting. The sensation is one of being morally defiled, and sweetness in the mouth, and a jubilant stomach gratified to the point of delight. Science did not stand still. Other methods were developed for artificial feeding. An enema through the anus, drops through the nose. 4. A new view of the hunger strike. That hunger strikes are a continuation of counter-revolutionary activity in prison and must be punished with a new prison term. This aspect promised to give rise to a very rich new category in the practices of the new type prison, but it remained essentially in the realm of threats. And it was not, of course, any sense of humor that cut it short, but most likely simple laziness. Why bother with all that when patience will take care of it? Patience and more patience. The patience of a well-fed person vis-a-vis one who is starving. Approximately in the middle of 1937, a new directive came. From now on, the prison administration will not in any respect be responsible for those dying on hunger strikes. The last vestige of personal responsibility on the part of the jailers had disappeared. In these circumstances, the prosecutor of the province would not have to come to visit Ch.12. Furthermore, so that the interrogator shouldn't get disturbed, it was also announced that days spent on hunger strike by a prisoner under interrogation should be crossed off the official interrogation period. In other words, it should not only be considered that the hunger strike had not taken place, but the prisoner should be regarded as not having been in prison at all during the period of the strike. Thus the interrogator would not be to blame for being behind schedule. Let the only perceptible result of the hunger strike be the prisoner's exhaustion. And that meant, if you want to kick the bucket, go ahead. Arnold Rappaport. had the misfortune to declare a hunger strike in the Archangel and KVD internal prison at the very moment when this directive arrived. It was a particularly severe form of hunger strike, and that ought, it would seem, to have given it more impact. His was a dry strike, without fluids, and he kept it up for 13 days. Compare the 5-day dry strike of Tyurzak, who probably was an isolated and separate cell, and who at the end won total victory. And during those 13 days in solitary, to which Rappaport had been moved, only a medical assistant looked in now and then. No doctor came, and no one from the administration took the slightest interest in what he was demanding from the hunger strike. They never even asked him. The only attention the administration paid him was to search his cell carefully, and they managed to dig out some hidden makorka and several matches. What Rappaport wanted was to put an end to the interrogator's humiliation of him. He had prepared for his strike in a thoroughly scientific way. He had received a food parcel earlier, and so he ate only butter and ring-shaped rolls, baranki, and he quit eating black bread for a week before his strike. He starved until he could see light through his hands. He recalled experiencing a sensation of lightheadedness and clarity of thought. At a certain moment, a kindly, compassionate woman jailer named Marussia came to his cell and whispered to him, "Stop your hunger strike. It isn't going to help. You'll just die. You should have done it a week earlier." He listened to her and called off his hunger strike without having got anywhere at all. Nevertheless, they gave him hot red wine and a roll. And afterward the jailers took him back to the common cell in a hand carry. A few days later his interrogation began again, but the hunger strike had not been entirely useless. The interrogator had come to understand that Rappaport had willpower enough and no fear of death, and he eased up on the interrogation. "Well now, it turns out that you are quite a wolf." And the interrogator said to him, "A wolf," Rappaport affirmed, "and I'll certainly never be your dog." Rappaport declared another hunger strike later on at the Kotlas transit prison, but it turned out somewhat comically. He announced that he was demanding a new interrogation and that he would not board the prisoner transport. They came to him on the 3rd day. "Get ready for prisoner transport. You don't have the right. I'm on hunger strike." At that point, 4 young toughs picked him up, carried him off, and tossed him into a bath. After a bath, they carried him off to the guardhouse. With nothing else left to do, Rappaport stood up and went to join the column of prisoners boarding the prisoner transport. After all, they were dogs and bayonets at his back. And that is how the new type prison defeated bourgeois hunger strikes. Even a strong man has no way left to fight in the prison machine, except perhaps suicide. But is suicide really resistance? Isn't it actually submission? Socialist revolutionary Ekaterina Oletskaya thinks that the Trotskyites and subsequently the communists who followed them into prison did a great deal to weaken a hunger strike as a weapon for fighting back. They declared hunger strikes too easily and lifted them too easily. She said that even Trotskyite leader I. Smirnov, after going on a hunger strike for 4 days before their Moscow trial, quickly surrendered and lifted it. They say that up to 1936 the Trotskyites rejected any hunger strike against the Soviet government on principle, and never supported socialist revolutionaries and social democrats who were on hunger strikes. Let history say how true that reproach is. However, no one has paid for hunger strikes so much and so grievously as the Trotskyites. We will come to their hunger strikes and their strikes in camps in Part 3. Excessive haste in declaring and lifting hunger strikes was probably characteristic of impetuous temperaments, which reveal their feelings too quickly. But there were, after all, such natures, such characters, among the old Russian revolutionaries too, and there were similar temperaments in Italy and France, but nowhere, either in pre-revolutionary Russia, in Italy, or in France, were the authorities so successful in discouraging hunger strikes as in the Soviet Union. There was probably no less physical sacrifice and no less spiritual determination in the hunger strikes in the second quarter of our century than there had been in the first, but there was no public opinion in the Soviet Union, and on that basis the new type prison waxed and grew strong, and instead of easy victories, prisoners suffered hard-earned defeats. Decades passed, and time produced its own results. A hunger strike, the first and most natural weapon of the prisoner, in the end became alien and incomprehensible to the prisoners themselves. Fewer and fewer desired to undertake them, and to prison administrations the whole thing began to seem either plainly stupid or else a malicious violation. When in 1960 Gennady Smirnov, a non-political offender, declared a lengthy hunger strike in the Leningrad prison, the prosecutor went to his cell for some reason, perhaps he was making his regular rounds, and asked him, "Why are you torturing yourself?" And Smirnov replied, "Justice is more precious to me than life." This phrase so astonished the prosecutor with its irrelevance that the very next day Smirnov was taken to the Leningrad Special Hospital, i.e. the insane asylum, for prisoners, and the doctor there told him, "We suspect you may be a schizophrenic." Along the rings of the Horn, where it began to narrow to its point, the former central prisons arose, rechristened by the beginning of 1937 the Special Isolators. The last weaknesses were now being squeezed out of the system, the last vestiges of light and air, and the hunger strike of the tired socialists, their numbers sparse by now, in the Yaroslavl penalty isolator, and at the beginning of 1937 was one of their last desperate efforts. They were still demanding that everything should be restored to what it once had been. They were demanding both the election of spokesmen and free communication between cells, but it is unlikely that they even had hopes of this any longer. By a 15-day hunger strike, even though it ended with their being force-fed through tube, they had apparently succeeded in defeating some portions of their regiment. A 1-hour period outdoors, access to the provincial newspaper, notebooks for their writing, these they kept, but the authorities promptly took away their personal belongings and threw at them the common prisoner clothing of the special isolator, and a little while later they cut half an hour off their time outdoors, and they reduced it by another 15 minutes. These were the same people who were being dragged through the sequence of prisons and exiles according to the rules of the big solitaire. Some hadn't lived an ordinary, decent human life for 10 years, some 15, and all they had was this meager prison life and hunger strikes to boot. A few who had gotten used to winning out over the prison administrations before the revolution were still alive. However, before the revolution, they were marching in step with time against a weakening enemy, and now time was against them, and allied with an enemy growing steadily stronger. Among them were young people too. How strange that seems to us nowadays. Those who considered themselves socialist revolutionaries, social democrats, or anarchists, even after the parties themselves had been battered out of existence. And the only future these new recruits had to look forward to was life in prison. The loneliness surrounding the entire prison struggle of the socialists, which became more hopeless with every year that passed, grew more and more acute, approaching a vacuum in the end. And that was not how it had been under the Tsar. Throw open the prison doors and the public greeted them with flowers. Now they leafed through the newspapers and saw that they were being drenched with vituperation, with slops even, for it was the socialists, after all, whom Stalin saw as the most dangerous enemies of his socialism. And the people were silent. And what could give them any reason to dare suppose that the people had any kind of feeling left towards those they had not long before elected to the Constituent Assembly? And finally, the newspapers stopped showering profanity on them, because the Russian socialists had by that time come to seem so unimportant and so impotent and even non-existent. By this time, these socialists were remembered outside in freedom only as something belonging to the past, the distant past, and young people hadn't the slightest idea that socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks were still alive somewhere. And in the sequence of the Chimkent and the Cherdyn exile, and the Verkhnya, Uralsk, and Vladimir isolators, how could they not tremble in the dark, solitary confinement cells with muzzles by this time, and feel that perhaps their program and their leaders had been mistaken, that perhaps their tactics and actions had been mistaken too, and all their actions began to seem nothing but inaction, and their lives devoted only to suffering, a fatal delusion. Thank you for listening.